Most people think they know what fear is. Fear isn't a jump scare in a movie or a bump in the night. True fear is the cold sweat dripping down a woman's spine as she sits in seat 1A of a first-class flight, knowing the man hunting her has eyes everywhere. It's the realization that the stranger sitting next to her, the one who just calmly threatened the hitman sent to drag her off the plane, is actually the most ruthless underworld boss on the eastern seaboard. This isn't a fairy tale. This is the story of how Nora Ashford escaped a monster, only to hand her life over to the devil himself. And she would do it again. The harsh, fluorescent lights of John F. Kennedy International Airport, Terminal 4, blurred into long, white streaks as Nora Ashford pushed her way through the sea of weary travelers. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird, each beat echoing the countdown in her head. She had exactly 42 minutes until Richard's private driver, a hulking brute named Gregory, would arrive at their Upper East Side townhouse and find the master bedroom empty. Nora adjusted the collar of her oversized Burberry trench coat, pulling it higher to obscure the dark, mottled purple bruise flowering along her jawline. The heavy layer of MAC concealer she had plastered over it was already beginning to crack. Richard Sterling was not a man anyone simply walked away from. As a billionaire real estate magnate with half the NYPD's 19th precinct on his unofficial payroll, he owned the city. He owned the politicians, he owned the judges, and until an hour ago, he had owned her. She clutched a sleek black leather tote bag to her chest. Inside was everything she had left in the world. $50,000 in tightly banded $100 bills she had spent 2 years skimming from household expenses, a burner phone, and a counterfeit Canadian passport bearing the name Sarah Jenkins. Flight BA112 to London. Heathrow is now boarding first class and One World Emerald members at Gate A4, the overhead speaker chimed, the automated voice painfully chipper. Nora practically threw herself toward the boarding lane. Her hands shook violently as she handed her fake passport and boarding pass to the gate agent. She held her breath, waiting for the red light to flash, for alarms to sound, for heavy hands to grab her shoulders. Instead, the scanner beeped a cheerful green. "Have a pleasant flight, Miss Jenkins." The agent smiled, handing the documents back. Nora nodded, unable to form words around the lump of sheer terror in her throat. She hurried down the jet bridge, the heavy scent of jet fuel and sanitized air filling her lungs. It smelled like freedom. It smelled like survival. She stepped into the hushed, dimly lit sanctuary of the first-class cabin. The flight attendants murmured polite greetings, their voices soft and trained. Nora found her suite, seat 1A. She tossed her tote bag onto the plush leather footrest and collapsed into the wide seat, her entire body trembling as the adrenaline began to recede, leaving behind an exhausting, bone-deep ache. She turned her head to look out the window at the tarmac. She had done it, she thought, closing her eyes. She was out. "You're in my light." The voice came from the suite directly across the aisle, seat 1B. It was a low, resonant baritone, carrying a subtle, gravelly edge that instantly commanded the space around it. Nora's eyes snapped open, and she turned. The man sitting there was perfectly still, an iPad resting on his lap. He wore a bespoke, charcoal grey Brioni suit that fit his broad shoulders with military precision. His dark hair was neatly styled, but it was his face that made Nora's breath hitch. It was carved from granite. Sharp jaw, high cheekbones, and eyes so dark they were practically obsidian. He radiated an aura of quiet, absolute violence. There was a faint, jagged scar slicing through his left eyebrow, a violent imperfection on an otherwise aristocratic face. Nora immediately recognized the Rolex Daytona on his wrist. Richard owned the same one. It was the watch of men who dictated terms. I apologize," Nora stammered, quickly reaching up to lower the window shade, plunging her side of the cabin into dimness. The man didn't thank her. He didn't even look at her. He merely continued scrolling through his screen. Nora shrank back into her seat, a new, primal kind of anxiety prickling at the back of her neck. She had spent 5 years learning to read the moods of a dangerous man, and every survival instinct she possessed was screaming that the man in 1B was infinitely more lethal than Richard Sterling could ever hope to be. 10 minutes passed. The cabin doors remained open. The anxiety in Nora's chest tightened into a vice. Why weren't they moving? She panicked internally, checking the clock on her phone. Richard knew by now. He definitely knew. Suddenly, heavy footsteps echoed from the front galley. It wasn't the measured tread of a flight attendant. It was the sound of someone searching. Nora peeked over the edge of her privacy partition. A man in a cheap, off-the-rack suit was arguing with the lead flight attendant. Nora recognized him instantly. It was Thomas, Richard's personal fixer. "I have authorization to pull her off this flight," Thomas sneered, flashing a badge that was undoubtedly a forgery provided by one of Richard's dirty cops. "She's a person of interest in a domestic incident, Suite 1A. Nora stopped breathing. The walls of the cabin seemed to close in, crushing the oxygen from her lungs. The flight attendant looked flustered, glancing nervously toward Nora's seat. Thomas shoved past the attendant, his eyes locking onto Nora with a predatory gleam. "There you are, Mrs. Sterling," Thomas said, a cruel smile twisting his lips as he stepped into the aisle. "Mr. Sterling is very worried about you. You're coming with me." Nora pressed herself into the corner of her seat, her mind racing for a weapon, a scream, an escape route. There was none. She was trapped in a metal tube, thousands of miles from nowhere. "I'm not going anywhere with you," Nora whispered, though her voice shook so badly it lacked any authority. "Leave me alone." "Don't make a scene, Nora," Thomas warned, stepping closer, his hand reaching out to grip her wrist. "You know how Richard gets when you embarrass him in public. Walk off this plane quietly, and maybe he won't break the other side of your face." He lunged forward, his thick fingers closing painfully around her forearm. Nora let out a sharp cry of pain, her fingers clawing desperately at the upholstery. She prepared to scream, to fight tooth and nail, when a sound stopped everyone in the cabin cold. It was the soft metallic click of an iPad being set down on a tray table. "You are disrupting my pre-flight quiet," the voice from seat 1B murmured. Thomas froze, turning his head to glare at the man in the charcoal suit. "Mind your own business, pal. This is a private matter. My boss has connections that could ruin your life before this plane even touches down." The man slowly turned his head, his dark eyes locked onto Thomas with a chilling, deadpan calm. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even uncross his legs. "Your boss," the man said smoothly, the gravel in his voice more pronounced now, "is Richard Sterling, a glorified landlord who thinks bribing a few beat cops makes him a king." Thomas blanched, his grip on Nora's arm loosening fractionally. "How do you know that?" "I know many things," the man replied. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a slim, silver monogrammed money clip. He tossed it lightly into the air, caught it, and placed it on the armrest. "I also know that if you do not let go of that woman's arm in the next 3 seconds, I am going to have my associates in the terminal downstairs detach your head from your shoulders and mail it to Richard in a shoebox." The silence in the cabin was deafening. The flight attendants had vanished. The few other first-class passengers were pretending to be asleep, terrified by the sudden drop in the room's temperature. Thomas tried to laugh, but it came out as a wet, nervous cough. "You're bluffing. You don't know who you're messing with." The man finally stood up. He was at least 6'3", towering over Thomas. He took one step into the aisle, closing the distance between them. He leaned in, his mouth hovering just inches from Thomas's ear. "My name," he whispered, though in the dead silence of the cabin, Nora heard every syllable perfectly, "is Leonardo Cavallaro. Tell Richard that if he ever sends one of his mutts onto my flight again, I will burn his little real estate empire to the ground with him inside it. Now, get off." Thomas turned the color of ash. Nora watched, paralyzed by shock, as Richard's ruthless fixer, a man who had broken fingers and ruined lives without a second thought, physically recoiled. He didn't say a word. He simply backed away, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender, before turning and practically sprinting down the jet bridge. A moment later, the heavy thud of the cabin door sealing shut echoed through the plane. "Flight attendants, please prepare doors for departure and cross-check," the captain's voice announced over the intercom. Leonardo Cavallaro slowly turned back to his seat. He picked up his iPad, adjusted his cuffs, and sat down as if nothing had happened. Nora sat frozen in 1A. Her arm throbbed where Thomas had gripped her, but the pain was eclipsed by a terrifying realization. She had read the name Leonardo Cavallaro in the news. He wasn't a businessman. He was the undisputed head of the Cavallaro crime family, a syndicate so deeply entrenched in international shipping, narcotics, and organized crime that the FBI had spent a decade trying and failing to build a case against him. She had just been saved from her abusive husband by the most dangerous man in New York City. The engines roared to life, the massive Boeing 777 vibrating beneath them. As the plane pushed back from the gate, Nora couldn't tear her eyes away from the man across the aisle. "Why are you staring at me, Nora?" Leonardo asked, his eyes still fixed on his screen. She swallowed hard. "How do you know my name? The manifest says Sarah Jenkins." Leonardo finally looked at her. His gaze was heavy, dissecting her in a way that made her feel entirely exposed. "I own a significant portion of the holding company that operates this airline. I know the real name of everyone who steps onto my planes, especially the wife of a man who currently owes me $12 million. The plane accelerated down the runway, pinning Nora against her seat. Her breath caught in her throat as the wheels left the tarmac. She wasn't free. She had just traded one cage for another, suspended 30,000 feet in the air. For the first 2 hours of the flight, neither of them spoke. The seatbelt sign chimed off, and the flight attendants moved through the cabin with ghost-like efficiency, serving champagne and warm nuts. They actively avoided making eye contact with Leonardo, addressing him only when absolutely necessary, their voices trembling slightly. Nora stared blankly at her untouched glass of Laurent Perrier. Her mind was a chaotic storm of calculations. $12 million. Richard owed the Mafia $12 million. It made terrifying sense. Over the past 6 months, Richard had become increasingly paranoid, his outbursts more violent, his drinking spiraling out of control. The business deals he bragged about at dinner parties were a facade. He was drowning in debt. "You're making a mess of your lip," Nora startled, snapping out of her thoughts. Leonardo had set his iPad aside. The dim cabin lighting caught the sharp angles of his face, making him look less like a man and more like a predator resting in the shadows. She realized she had been gnawing on her lower lip so hard it was bleeding. She quickly wiped it with a napkin. "Sorry." "Don't apologize to me," Leonardo said, his tone flat, unreadable. Apologies are for the weak. They are a submission. Have you submitted? I ran, didn't I? Nora fired back, a sudden spark of defensive anger flaring in her chest. She surprised herself. Usually, when men like this spoke, she shrank, but she had nothing left to lose. A ghost of a smirk played on Leonardo's lips. It was gone before she could be sure she saw it. Running isn't fighting, it's just a delay. Richard will find you. If not in London, then in Paris or Rome. He has the resources. Not if I disappear. You can't disappear with $50,000 and a poorly forged Canadian passport, Nora. She felt the blood drain from her face. How do you... I had my security detail run a background check on Sarah Jenkins while we were waiting at the gate, Leonardo interrupted, pouring himself a glass of sparkling water. Your alias was flagged in 3 different international databases. The man who sold it to you in Queens ripped you off. Nora felt a sickening drop in her stomach. Her grand escape, her carefully laid plans, they were garbage. If Leonardo knew, immigration at Heathrow would definitely know. She would be detained, deported, and handed right back to Richard. She pressed her palms against her eyes, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill over. She refused to cry in front of this man. Then why didn't you let Thomas take me? Why stop him? Leonardo leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. The space between them suddenly felt suffocatingly small. Because Richard Sterling is a parasite. He owes my family money, and instead of paying me, he sent his pathetic lapdog onto my flight to retrieve his runaway wife. It was an insult. I do not tolerate insults. He paused, his dark eyes tracing the line of her jaw. Without warning, he reached across the aisle. Nora flinched, instinctively bracing for a strike, squeezing her eyes shut. But the strike never came. Instead, she felt the cool, surprisingly gentle brush of a linen napkin against her cheek. She opened her eyes. Leonardo was wiping away the cracked MAC concealer, exposing the ugly, dark purple bruise blooming on her face. His expression didn't change, but his jaw tightened, the muscle ticking furiously. He hits you where he thinks people won't see, a coward's tactic. Why do you care? Nora whispered, her voice cracking. I don't, Leonardo replied coldly, withdrawing his hand and tossing the stained napkin onto his tray. But I do care about leverage. Richard loves his public image more than he loves his own life. He's running for a seat on the city council next year. A high-profile divorce, coupled with photos of a battered wife, would destroy him. Nora shook her head. I don't have proof. He pays off the doctors. He destroyed the security footage in the penthouse. You don't need proof. You just need me. Leonardo sat back, steepling his fingers. When we land in London, my men will bypass customs. You will come with me to my estate in Surrey. You will be under my protection. Nora stared at him, bewildered. Protection? Why would you protect me? Because, Nora, Leonardo said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, silken whisper. You are going to help me dismantle Richard Sterling, piece by piece. You know his accounts, you know his passwords, you know where he buries his secrets. You give me the keys to his empire, and I will erase his debt by taking everything he owns. And if I refuse? Then I leave you at Heathrow Customs. You'll be back in Richard's penthouse by tomorrow night. It wasn't a choice. It was an ultimatum from a man who held all the cards. Nora looked into Leonardo's dark, fathomless eyes. She saw violence there, yes, but she also saw order, a strict, terrifying code. Richard was chaotic, a hurricane of drunken rage. Leonardo was a sniper's bullet, cold, precise, and deadly. If I do this, Nora said, her voice steadying as she found a core of steel she didn't know she possessed. If I help you ruin him, I want a guarantee." Leonardo raised an eyebrow, clearly amused by her audacity. "A guarantee? I want absolute freedom. When you're done with him, you give me a real new identity, real money, and you never come looking for me again." Leonardo studied her for a long, agonizing moment. The steady hum of the jet engines filled the silence. Finally, he extended his large, calloused hand across the aisle. "Do we have a deal, Mrs. Sterling?" Nora looked at his hand. It was the hand of a killer, a criminal, a monster. But as she placed her small hand in his, feeling his strong fingers wrap around hers in a firm, unbreakable grip, she knew she had just made a pact with the devil. "Call me Nora," she said. Leonardo's lips curved into a faint, dangerous smile. "Welcome to the family, Nora." Heathrow Airport was a blur of grey skies and driving rain, but Nora didn't see the inside of a terminal. True to his word, Leonardo's plane taxied away from the commercial gates, stopping at a private, secluded tarmac. 3 black Range Rovers idled on the wet asphalt, their engines purring in unison. Men in tailored dark suits and earpieces stood rigidly by the doors, holding large black umbrellas. There were no customs agents, no passport checks, no flashing lights. Leonardo Cavallaro moved through the world with a frictionless, terrifying ease. Nora stepped out into the freezing English rain, the collar of her trench coat pulled tight. Leonardo walked beside her, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back. It wasn't a comforting gesture. It was a physical tether, a silent message to the heavily armed men surrounding them that she was his property, his guest, his asset. "Get her inside," Leonardo ordered briefly to a tall, ash-blonde man with a jagged scar across his throat. This was Silas, Leonardo's right hand. Silas didn't speak. He merely nodded, his cold blue eyes assessing Nora with clinical detachment before opening the door to the lead SUV. The drive to Surrey took just under an hour. Nora watched the sprawling London suburbs melt into dense, manicured forests and rolling green hills. When the convoy finally slowed, turning onto a private road flanked by towering iron gates, Nora got her first look at her new cage. The estate was a sprawling, multi-million-pound Tudor manor, its dark brick and ivy-covered walls exuding ancient wealth. But the beauty was a veneer. Nora's eyes, trained by years of living with a paranoid man, caught the subtle gleam of high-definition security cameras tucked into the stonework, the reinforced steel frames of the antique doors, and the rhythmic patrol routes of men carrying suppressed submachine guns under their coats. Once inside, Nora was escorted to a massive library on the second floor. The walls were lined with first editions, a roaring fire crackled in the hearth, and a heavy mahogany desk dominated the center of the room. On the desk sat a sleek, custom-built laptop, completely untraceable. "Start," Leonardo said, stepping into the room and closing the heavy oak doors behind him. He removed his suit jacket, rolling up the sleeves of his crisp white shirt, revealing forearms corded with muscle and a dark, intricate tattoo of a serpent coiled around a dagger on his left inner wrist. Nora sat at the desk. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the laptop. "Where do you want me to begin?" "Richard thinks he's clever," Leonardo said, pouring 2 fingers of amber liquid from a crystal decanter on a side table. He didn't offer her any. "He uses a network of shell companies to hide his assets, but men like Richard are creatures of ego and habit. They always leave a back door for themselves." "He uses a proprietary encrypted server located in a server farm in New Jersey," Nora murmured, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. "He bought the farm through a proxy 3 years ago. The proxy's name is William Davies. It's the name of his childhood golden retriever." Leonardo paused, the glass halfway to his lips. A dark, genuine amusement flickered in his eyes. A golden retriever. Brilliant. Nora typed rapidly. He kept the root access codes in a physical ledger, but he's too lazy to check it every time. I installed a keystroke logger on his home office computer 8 months ago when he was passed out drunk on a Tuesday. Leonardo set his glass down, the amusement vanishing, replaced by a sharp, calculating intensity. He walked over to the desk, standing just behind her chair. Nora could feel the heat radiating from him, the faint scent of sandalwood and gunpowder clinging to his clothes. "You planned this," Leonardo observed, his voice low. "You didn't just run. You gathered ammunition." "You don't survive Richard Sterling by reacting," Nora said, staring at the blinking cursor on the screen, her voice devoid of emotion. "You survive by anticipating. I knew if I ever left, he would freeze my accounts, destroy my credit, and put a bounty on my head. I needed insurance." And yet, Leonardo leaned in closer, his breath ghosting over her ear, making a shiver race down her spine. "You bought a fake passport from a corner store hustler in Queens." Nora stopped typing. The shame burned her cheeks. "I know how to navigate Richard's digital life. I don't know how to navigate the criminal underworld. I made a mistake." "In my world, Nora, mistakes are paid for in blood," Leonardo said softly. He stepped back, putting distance between them. "Consider yourself fortunate that your mistake led you to my flight." For the next 3 days, Nora barely left the library. The manor staff brought her meals on silver trays, which she ate absently, while buried in lines of code and offshore bank statements. Leonardo was a constant, brooding presence. He would sit in a leather wingback chair by the fire, reading reports, making hushed phone calls in rapid-fire Italian, and watching her. He never yelled. He never raised a hand. Yet Nora found herself constantly braced for impact. The trauma of Richard's abuse was etched into her nervous system. Every time Leonardo entered the room, every time a door slammed shut downstairs, her shoulders would flinch, her breath catching in her throat. On the 4th night, the silence broke. Nora was staring at a labyrinthine series of wire transfers routed through the Cayman Islands when a sudden, heavy crash echoed from the hallway, followed by Silas shouting. Nora violently flinched, her knee slamming into the underside of the desk. She gasped, scrambling backward in her chair, her arms instinctively raising to shield her face. The library door opened. Leonardo stepped in. He stopped dead, his dark eyes locking onto her defensive posture. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Nora slowly lowered her arms, her heart hammering against her ribs, a hot flush of embarrassment crawling up her neck. I thought... Silas dropped a crate of munitions, Leonardo said, his voice terrifyingly calm. He walked slowly toward her. Nora pressed her back into the leather chair. Leonardo knelt beside her, bringing himself down to her eye level. He didn't touch her, but his proximity was magnetic, demanding all her attention. "Look at me," he commanded softly. Nora forced herself to meet his gaze. His eyes were entirely black in the dim light of the library. "I am a violent man, Nora," Leonardo said, his words measured, carrying the weight of a confession. "I have ended lives. I have ruined families. I am the monster that hides in the dark." He paused, his jaw tightening. "But I do not hit women, and I do not break things that are already broken. You will never flinch in my presence again. Do you understand?" It wasn't a request. It was a mandate, an order to feel safe. Nora stared at him, breathlessly. For the first time in 5 years, looking into the eyes of a Mafia boss, she realized she believed him. "Yes," she whispered. Leonardo held her gaze for a second longer, then stood up, his emotional armor slamming back into place. "Good. What have you found?" Nora turned back to the screen, her hands suddenly steady. "I found the 12 million he owes you, but Leonardo, that's not the worst of it." Leonardo moved behind her, his hands resting flat on the mahogany desk, boxing her in. "Explain." Nora clicked open a hidden folder disguised as a system diagnostic file. "I was tracking the 12 million. Richard didn't lose it in bad real estate deals like he claims. The money was moved into a holding company called Apex Logistics. Apex is a shell company I use for moving untaxed freight through the port of Newark," Leonardo said, his voice dropping an octave. "Richard knows that." "Exactly," Nora said, her fingers flying over the trackpad. "But Richard didn't just wire your money into Apex. Look at the ledger dates. Over the last 18 months, he's been routing millions of dollars from a dozen different offshore accounts into Apex Logistics. Once the money sits in your shell company for 48 hours, it's wired out in small, randomized batches to accounts in Bogota, Sinaloa, and Miami." Leonardo's breathing stopped. The temperature in the room plummeted. "Let me see those routing numbers," he demanded, his voice devoid of any warmth. Nora highlighted the data. Leonardo stared at the screen, his posture going rigid. The silence in the library was no longer peaceful. It was the suffocating silence before a bomb detonates. "The Reyes Cartel," Leonardo breathed, the name carrying a lethal weight. Nora turned her head. "A cartel?" Leonardo straightened up, pacing away from the desk, his hands running through his dark hair. "The Reyes family are butchers. They move narcotics up the eastern seaboard. I have spent a decade keeping them out of my ports, out of my city. I refused their money. I killed their lieutenants when they tried to push into my territory." He turned back to Nora, his eyes blazing with a terrifying, unholy fury. "Richard didn't just steal $12 million from me. He used my own holding company to launder over $50 million for the Reyes Cartel. He made me their mule." Nora felt the blood drain from her face. Richard wasn't just a desperate, indebted businessman anymore. He was playing two of the deadliest crime syndicates in the world against each other. "If the feds raid Apex Logistics," Leonardo continued, his voice accelerating, "they won't find my tax evasion. They'll find a massive money laundering hub for a South American cartel. It would bring the entire FBI down on the Cavallaro family. The RICO indictments alone would destroy my syndicate." "He set you up," Nora whispered, the sheer scale of Richard's betrayal making her nauseous. "He was going to let you take the fall for the cartel's dirty money, while he walked away clean." Leonardo walked to the window, staring out into the pitch-black, rain-swept grounds. He signed his own death warrant, and he just started a war. Leonardo pulled a sleek, encrypted satellite phone from his pocket and hit a single speed dial button. "Silas, get in here, now." Within 10 seconds, the heavy library doors swung open. Silas stepped in, an unsuppressed Glock 19 already in his hand, his eyes scanning the room for a threat. "Put it away," Leonardo snapped. "Call Matteo in New York. Tell him to mobilize the strike teams. I want Richard Sterling's properties burned to the foundation. Every warehouse, every development site. I want his corrupt cops bought out or buried. And find Richard. Do not kill him. Bring him to me breathing." "Boss," Silas said, his voice a low gravel. "The hit on Sterling is going to make noise. The commission won't like it." "Screw the commission," Leonardo snarled, slamming his fist onto the side table, rattling the crystal decanter. "Sterling is laundering Reyes cartel money through Apex. He weaponized my ports." Silas's pale face hardened, a lethal understanding washing over him. "I'll make the call." "Wait," Nora interrupted, her voice trembling, but loud enough to stop Silas in his tracks. Both men turned to look at her. "If you attack him now, Richard will panic. He'll go to the cartel for protection. You won't be able to touch him, and the cartel will know you've discovered the money laundering." Leonardo stared at her, his eyes narrowing. "And what do you suggest, Nora?" "You cut off his oxygen first," she said, her mind racing, adopting the ruthless logic of the room. "The Reyes cartel only cares about their money. If the money stops flowing, Richard becomes a liability to them. Let me freeze his accounts. All of them. The clean money, the dirty money, the offshore trusts. I can lock him out of his entire financial network." Leonardo approached the desk slowly, looking at Nora as if seeing her for the first time. The terrified, battered wife he had pulled off the airplane was gone. In her place sat a woman hardened by survival, weaponizing her trauma to destroy her abuser. "If you freeze those accounts," Leonardo said, "the cartel will demand their money. When Richard can't pay, they will serve him to you on a silver platter," Nora finished. A slow, dark smile spread across Leonardo's face. It was the smile of a predator admiring a perfectly laid trap. "Do it." Nora turned back to the laptop. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, executing lines of code, changing passwords, initiating multi-factor lockouts on accounts spread across 5 continents. With every keystroke, she was dismantling the empire of the man who had kept her a prisoner for 5 years. "Done," she said, hitting the final return key. "He is entirely locked out. He has exactly the cash in his wallet and nothing else." Before Leonardo could respond, the heavy, muffled silence of the Surrey estate was shattered. It wasn't a crash this time. It was the sharp, unmistakable crack of a high-powered sniper rifle. The large bay window of the library exploded inward, showering the room in shards of razor-sharp glass. Nora screamed as the antique crystal decanter on the side table violently disintegrated into powder. "Down!" Leonardo roared. He lunged across the space between them. Nora didn't have time to react before Leonardo's massive frame slammed into her, tackling her out of the heavy leather chair and pinning her to the floor behind the solid oak desk. Another crack echoed through the night. The laptop on the desk sparked and shattered, smoking as a bullet tore through its casing. Sirens began to wail across the estate. The sounds of automatic gunfire erupted from the courtyard below, a chaotic, deafening symphony of violence. "Silas!" Leonardo yelled over the gunfire, drawing a heavy matte black pistol from a shoulder holster hidden beneath his shirt. "Breach at the south gate," Silas shouted, crawling across the floor toward the heavy library doors. "It's a hit squad, heavily armed. They bypassed the outer perimeter sensors." "The cartel!" Leonardo snarled, his body covering Nora's, shielding her entirely. He looked down at her, his dark eyes blazing with adrenaline and a feral protective rage. "They didn't just find Richard's money," Nora whispered, terror gripping her throat as the reality of the situation crashed down on her. "No," Leonardo said, racking the slide of his pistol, his jaw set in a murderous line. "They tracked the server ping. They found you." The air inside the library was choked with the acrid stench of pulverized plaster and cordite. Nora lay pinned beneath the crushing weight of Leonardo's body, her cheek pressed against the rough wool of the antique Persian rug. Her ears rang violently, a high-pitched whine that drowned out the staccato bursts of automatic gunfire echoing from the floor below. Leonardo shifted slightly, his heavy frame shielding her as he raised his head just enough to assess the shattered window. Rain whipped through the broken glass, soaking the mahogany debris. "Are you hit?" Leonardo's voice was a harsh, gravelly whisper right next to her ear. Nora gasped for air, her hands instinctively checking her own ribs. "No, No, I'm okay. Stay low. Do not stand up until I tell you. Leonardo rolled off her in one fluid, predatory motion. He didn't look like a businessman anymore. The mask of civility had completely vaporized. He crouched beside the heavy oak desk, his matte black pistol gripped loosely in his right hand, his eyes scanning the shadowed hallway beyond the open library doors. Silas was already there, his back pressed against the doorframe, reloading his Glock with terrifying speed. "They have the main staircase," Silas reported, his voice devoid of panic. "At least a dozen of them. Tactical gear, suppressed weapons. They aren't local thugs, boss. This is a Reyes Zero team. They came to wipe the board." "They tracked her localized ping when she locked Sterling's accounts," Leonardo said, his jaw tightening. "They knew he couldn't have executed a global lockout. They realized someone else had their money." Nora's stomach twisted into a sickening knot. It was her fault, she thought. Panic threatening to freeze her limbs. She had brought the war to his front door. "Leonardo," Nora choked out, crawling toward him, her hands scraped by shattered glass. "The localized security grid. The Manor's internal network is on a closed loop, right? It's not connected to the external server I was using." Leonardo looked down at her, his dark eyes intensely focused. "Yes, the mainframe is in the basement." "I don't need the mainframe," Nora said, her voice steadying as adrenaline hijacked her terror. "Give me your phone. If I can tether it to the estate's internal Wi-Fi, I can pull up the live feeds on the secondary app. I can see where they are." A flicker of genuine respect crossed Leonardo's face. Without a word, he tossed her the heavy, encrypted satellite phone. Nora caught it. Her fingers were slick with nervous sweat, but muscle memory took over. She bypassed the security firewalls. She had spent the last 3 days studying the estate's digital architecture just to understand her surroundings. Within 40 seconds, the dark screen illuminated with a grid of 12 high-definition camera feeds. "I have them," Nora whispered, staring at the grainy night vision feeds. 4 men in the main foyer, 2 moving through the East Wing kitchen, and, oh God, there are 3 more coming up the servants' staircase. They're flanking us. "Silas, the servants' stairs," Leonardo ordered. Silas didn't hesitate. He pivoted out of the doorway and sprinted silently down the carpeted hall. A moment later, the deafening roar of close-quarters gunfire erupted, followed by the heavy, sickening thud of bodies hitting the hardwood floor. Silas reappeared, his left arm hanging awkwardly by his side, a dark stain spreading across the shoulder of his bespoke suit. "Stairs are clear," Silas hissed through clenched teeth. "But we have a problem. They planted C4 charges on the reinforced doors downstairs. They aren't trying to take the house. They're trying to collapse the foundation and bury us." Leonardo's expression turned utterly lethal. "We leave. Now. The extraction tunnel in the wine cellar." He turned to Nora, grabbing her firmly by the upper arm and hauling her to her feet. "Keep your eyes on that screen. You are our navigator, Nora. Do not freeze." She nodded, clutching the phone like a lifeline. They moved out of the library and into the dark corridor. The Grand Surrey estate was unrecognizable. Smoke billowed up the grand staircase, thick and suffocating. The beautiful tapestries were riddled with bullet holes. "Wait," Nora gasped, pulling back on Leonardo's arm. She pointed to a feed on the screen. "The foyer team is moving up the main stairs. If we cross the gallery, they'll see us." "Alternate route," Leonardo demanded. "Through the master suite," Nora said, swiping to the next camera. "There's an adjoining door to the West Wing study. We can take the dumbwaiter shaft down to the cellar level." Leonardo took the lead, his body a shield between Nora and the open spaces of the manor. They moved with agonizing slowness through the shadows. The sound of shouting in rapid Spanish echoed off the vaulted ceilings. The Reyes Sicarios were sweeping the rooms, executing anything that breathed. They reached the master suite. The door was locked. Leonardo didn't bother with the handle. He raised his leg and kicked the heavy timber door precisely at the deadbolt. The wood splintered with a loud crack. Gunfire immediately tore through the drywall from the adjacent hallway. The cartel men had heard the breach. "Go!" Leonardo shoved Nora into the room. She stumbled, falling onto the plush carpet. Silas followed, returning fire blindly through the wall to keep their attackers pinned. Leonardo locked the door, dragged a heavy mahogany dresser across the frame with inhuman strength, and turned to the adjoining door leading to the study. It was open. Nora scrambled to her feet, looking at the phone. "They're breaching the hall. They're right outside." "Get in the shaft," Leonardo barked at Silas, pointing to the brass doors of the antique dumbwaiter in the study. "It won't hold all three of us," Silas said, leaning heavily against the wall, his face pale from blood loss. "You and Nora go. I will hold the suite." "No!" Nora screamed, the word ripping from her throat before she could stop it. The idea of leaving him behind, the man who had just risked his entire empire to save her, felt like swallowing ground glass. Leonardo stepped toward her. The gunfire outside the door intensified, the wood beginning to splinter as bullets chewed through the barrier. He grabbed her face in both of his hands, his thumbs pressing into her cheeks. His hands were covered in plaster dust and blood, but they were warm. "Listen to me," Leonardo said, his voice dropping into a register that commanded absolute obedience. "You survived a monster for 5 years. You will survive tonight. You get in that shaft, you take Silas to the garage, and you take the armored rover. You do not look back." "I'm not leaving you," Nora cried, tears finally breaking free, cutting tracks through the dust on her face. "You said we had a deal." A faint, tragic smile touched Leonardo's lips. "I lied. Get her out of here, Silas." Silas grabbed Nora around the waist, physically lifting her off the ground as she kicked and fought. He shoved her into the cramped, dark wooden box of the dumbwaiter. Silas squeezed in beside her, reaching up to cut the counterweight rope with a tactical knife. As the box began to plummet into the darkness of the shaft, Nora caught one final glimpse of Leonardo Cavallaro. He had turned his back to her, standing perfectly straight in the center of the room, raising his weapon as the bedroom door finally exploded inward in a shower of splinters and fire. Then, total darkness. The descent was a terrifying freefall that ended with a bone-jarring crash as the emergency brakes caught at the cellar level. Nora scrambled out of the shattered wooden box, gasping for air. The air down here was cold and smelled of damp earth and aged wine. Silas stumbled out behind her, groaning as his wounded shoulder hit the stone wall. "This way," he grunted, using his good arm to push aside a massive wine rack, revealing a heavy steel security door. He punched a bloody thumb onto the biometric scanner. The door hissed open, revealing a concrete tunnel lit by dim red emergency lights. They ran. Nora's lungs burned, her legs feeling like lead, but she didn't stop. They emerged 10 minutes later into a hidden subterranean garage a quarter-mile from the main house. A black, up-armored Range Rover sat idling, a driver already behind the wheel. Silas shoved Nora into the back seat and collapsed beside her. The SUV surged forward, blasting through a disguised garage door and tearing out into the dense, rain-soaked English woods. Nora twisted around, pressing her face against the rear window. In the distance, above the tree line, a massive fireball erupted into the night sky, illuminating the rain clouds in a hellish orange glow. The C4 had detonated. The Surrey estate was gone. Nora buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently as a hollow, devastating grief swallowed her whole. She had finally found someone strong enough to protect her, and it had cost him his life. 3 weeks later, the wind howling off the Scottish Highlands was bitter and unforgiving, whipping the dark waters of Loch Ness into a white-capped frenzy. Nora stood on the stone terrace of the isolated safe house, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, holding a mug of black tea that had gone cold an hour ago. The world had moved on, but Nora felt permanently anchored to that night in Surrey. The news cycle had been relentless. Richard Sterling's empire had collapsed in a spectacular, bloody fashion. With his accounts frozen and the Reyes cartel demanding their $50 million, Richard had nowhere to run. A week after the Surrey attack, his body was found stuffed into the trunk of a burned-out Mercedes in the New Jersey Pine Barrens. The authorities called it a mob hit. Nora knew it was an execution. She was free. Richard was dead. The cartel had exacted their vengeance on the man who stole from them. But freedom tasted like ash. The heavy oak door behind her opened, the brass hinges protesting against the wind. Nora didn't turn around. She assumed it was Silas, bringing her another tray of food she wouldn't eat. Silas had survived the gunshot, his arm in a sling, spending his days coordinating the remnants of the Cavallaro family from the secure bunker beneath the house. Heavy, measured footsteps crossed the stone terrace. They didn't belong to Silas. Nora's breath hitched. She turned slowly, the blanket slipping from her shoulders. Leonardo stood there. He looked older, harder, a fresh, jagged red scar cut across his left cheekbone, and he favored his right leg, relying heavily on a silver-tipped cane. But he was alive. His dark eyes, as fathomless and commanding as ever, locked onto hers. Nora dropped her mug. It shattered against the flagstones, but neither of them looked down. She closed the distance between them in 3 desperate strides, throwing her arms around his neck, burying her face into the collar of his heavy peacoat. She didn't care about his rigid code or his violent nature. She only cared that his heart was beating against her chest. Leonardo stiffened for a fraction of a second, entirely unaccustomed to the sudden, fierce embrace. Then, slowly, his large arms wrapped around her, pulling her tightly against him. He buried his face in her hair, breathing her in. "You're alive," she sobbed, her fingers gripping the lapels of his coat, as if he might vanish into the mist. "How?" "I am a difficult man to kill," Leonardo murmured, his gravelly voice sending a tremor of profound relief through her core. The cartel squad didn't realize the study floor was reinforced with steel plating. When the C4 blew, the floor held just long enough for me to reach the extraction tunnel. Barely. He pulled back gently, keeping his hands on her shoulders. He studied her face, his thumb reaching up to wipe away a stray tear. "I have been in a private surgical clinic in Zurich for the last 3 weeks," Leonardo explained. "I couldn't risk contacting you. If the Reyes family knew I was alive, they would have kept hunting." "And now?" Nora asked, her voice trembling. Leonardo's eyes darkened, the lethal Mafia boss returning to the surface. "Now, the Reyes cartel is leaderless. While I was in the clinic, my lieutenants used the routing numbers you uncovered. We fed the cartel's entire distribution network to the DEA, and we slaughtered what was left of their leadership in Miami. The war is over. I won." He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a thick, sealed manila envelope. He held it out to her. "What is this?" Nora asked, staring at the paper. "Your guarantee," Leonardo said softly. His voice held no emotion, but his jaw was clenched tight. "A legitimate Swiss passport, a new name that passes every Interpol database on Earth, and the routing numbers to an offshore account containing $20 million. The money I recovered from Richard. Nora looked at the envelope. It was exactly what she had asked for on that airplane. Absolute freedom. She could walk away right now, disappear into the Alps, and never look over her shoulder again. She had outlived her abuser, and she had survived the Mafia. She reached out and took the envelope. Leonardo let it go, taking a half step back, putting distance between them. It was a subtle movement, but Nora felt the chasm it created. "You are a ghost, Nora," Leonardo said, staring out at the turbulent water of the loch. "You are safe. A car is waiting out front to take you to the airstrip." Nora looked down at the envelope. She thought about the luxury of Switzerland, the quiet, the safety. And then she thought about the man standing in front of her. The man who had put himself between her and a bullet, who had fought a cartel to avenge an insult, and who had given her the power to destroy the monster who broke her. Switzerland would be safe, but it would be cold, and it would be empty. Nora walked over to a heavy iron brazier burning on the corner of the terrace. Without a moment of hesitation, she tossed the thick manila envelope directly into the roaring flames. Leonardo turned sharply, his eyes widening in rare, unguarded shock as the paper caught fire, the flames quickly consuming the passport and the bank details. "What are you doing?" he demanded, taking a step toward her. "That is your freedom." "No, it's not," Nora said, turning to face him, the firelight dancing in her eyes. The battered, terrified woman who had boarded flight BA112 was gone forever. In her place stood a queen, forged in the fires of an underworld war. "Freedom isn't running away, Leonardo. Freedom is looking the devil in the eye and realizing you're not afraid of the dark anymore." Leonardo stared at her, the mask of the cold, untouchable crime boss finally fracturing. He saw the fierce, unyielding loyalty in her eyes. She wasn't a hostage. She wasn't a pawn. She was his equal. He dropped his cane. It clattered against the stone. He closed the distance between them, wrapping his hands around her waist and pulling her flush against his body. "My world is violence, Nora," he whispered fiercely, his forehead resting against hers. "It is blood and shadows. If you stay, you can never leave. You belong to the family. You belong to me." "I stopped running the night I sat next to you," Nora answered, her voice unwavering. She reached up, tracing the rough line of his new scar. "I'm exactly where I belong." Leonardo didn't say another word. He captured her lips in a kiss that was as ruthless and possessive as the man himself, sealing a pact far deeper than money or survival. Nora kissed him back with equal ferocity, surrendering to the beautiful, dangerous chaos of the man who had saved her. She had fled a monster, only to give her heart to the devil. And as the wind howled across the Scottish Highlands, Nora Cavallaro knew she wouldn't have it any other way. For those who felt their pulse pounding and heart racing during Nora's terrifying escape and her descent into Leonardo Cavallaro's dangerous world, it is clear this isn't just another love story. It's a battle for survival. Did Nora make the right choice by throwing away her freedom to stay with the devil himself? Viewers are encouraged to share what they would have done in the comments below. For lovers of dark, high-stakes mafia romance, smashing that like button, sharing this story with friends who crave intense drama, and hitting subscribe ensures no one misses another thrilling episode. There are plenty more heart-stopping, twist-filled stories on the way, so ringing that notification bell welcomes everyone to the family. Until next time, keep secrets close, and remember, sometimes the most dangerous place is exactly where one belongs.